three middle-aged men, Fred, Tom, and Joe, were discussing the possibility of sudden death. And one of them said to the other, "What would happen if you only had 4 weeks to live?" Well, Fred, first off, said, "I know what I would do. I would quit my job, and for 4 weeks, I would fish every day." Tom said, "Well, not me. For those 4 weeks, I would spend every waking hour with my family, and I would let them know that I love them." And then Joe sat there and thought. He says, "I know what I would do. I would get into a car with my wife and my mother-in-law. We would travel the country, and we would stay at the cheapest motels we could find." And the other two look at Joe and says, Why would you do that?" And Joe said, "Because it would be the longest 4 weeks of my life." This morning, we are presented with a very interesting passage. Fascinating, really, because we could spend a whole month talking about each of the verses that are going to be read by Kim here. I certainly saw this during my research. As mentioned last week, we are in the midst of the Gospel of Mark. And last week we started at the practical very beginning of this Gospel. And in Mark, it is with Jesus' baptism. Now this week, we are still very early in the Gospel message. But this time around, we find a very interesting passage about family relationships. So Kim, would you share with us?
The reading is from Mark 1, verses 29 through 34. Jesus and his disciples, including James and John, left the synagogue and went straight to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a fever, and as soon as Jesus arrived, he was told about her. He went to her, took her by the hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. After the sun had set and evening had come, people brought to Jesus all the sick and those who had demons. All the people of the town gathered in front of the house. Jesus healed many who were sick with all kinds of diseases and drove out many demons. He would not let the demons say anything because they knew who he was.
Now, thank you. There are a lot of places that we could go with this passage. We could spend a significant amount of time looking at Simon, who is married, and the very fact that one of Jesus' disciples has a family. And speaking of that, we could talk about the mother-in-law and the interaction between Simon and his mother-in-law. And speaking of her, we could talk about the fact how she is sick. Jesus comes, heals her, and then immediately she begins to serve everybody. And no one ever goes to her and says, "Hey, would you just sit down and take it easy?" And then we also have the fact that Jesus' fame is growing here. It is going very quickly. And I know that there have been many a sermon that have been done about making sure that fame does not go to one's head. Yes, there's a lot that we could unpack here with this passage. First off, do we look at the silencing of the demons? That kind of goes along with our idea of talking about secret, but we had a sermon about that just a few weeks ago. We could talk about the role of service that was performed by the mother-in-law. And I think that would be a good one, but it doesn't quite fit into this message of getting us to the end of the story. You see, we're in the midst of something very special here. Mark, specifically the Gospel according to Mark, is a master storyteller. His goal is Easter and what takes place with Jesus and to us on that very special morning. This is why in Mark you will not find any story about Jesus' birth. There is nothing about there's nothing about Jesus and his childhood in the Gospel of Mark. What you find here is him immediately getting to the point, and that is Jesus' ministry. His focus is to get us to Easter and nothing else. He doesn't want us to get sidetracked with arguments over the virgin birth or of why Jesus walks on the water. His mission Mark's mission is for us to understand the very ministry of Jesus. And the best way to do that is simply to get to Easter as fast as possible. So Mark, what he does is he provides us little hints. I like to call them teasers, if you will. They kind of keep us reading, that kind of capture our interest and compel us to keep learning about this guy. Now today, our hint focuses on the very first healing of Jesus. The very first healing event that Jesus does. It is a reminder of exactly what our focus needs to be on. It's Jesus, his ministry, and nothing else. William Barclay tells about this compelling story of a group of soldiers during World War II. They had a comrade that dies on the battlefield, and they want to honor him, and they decide that they're going to bury him at a church. So they search for the closest church, and they find a church that has a cemetery behind the church and a fence around it. And they go in and they find the priest, and they ask the priest if they could bury their friend in their cemetery. And the first thing the priest says is your friend Catholic? Well, no, they say. Our friend is not Catholic. And so the priest says, well, I'm sorry, but this cemetery is only reserved for those of the Holy Church. As you can tell, the soldiers are quite upset. And the priest says, but you know what? You can bury your friend just outside the fence. I will make sure that his gravesite is attended to. So the friends do that. They bury him, and they go off to the war front. Soon after the war ends, and before they're shipped off to their home country, they decide that they are going to visit their friend one last time. And so they search and they find the church and they find the cemetery and they find the fence, and they go to the place where they remember burying their friend, but they cannot find his gravesite. And so they go into the church and they find the priest, and they tell him the story, and the priest remembers them, and he says, we cannot find our friend. What happened to him? And the priest says, you know, after you buried your friend, I felt awful telling you you couldn't bury him inside the fence. And so I did something. I did something. The friend said, oh, you reburied him. And the priest said, no, I moved the fence. Focus now on Jesus' ministry. In Mark, there is a strong emphasis not on rules, not on doctrine, not on belief, but on our relationship with our brothers and sisters. Focus now. This is the message of Mark. To keep us reading to the end of the story, in his first healing act, Jesus states what is important. Love and respect for each other. In his first healing act, Jesus puts a stamp on what we need to focus on, our relationships to each other. You know, in our age of social media, I think we sometimes lose sight of this fact. We tend to worry about who believes what, or who was right, or who was liking this page, or who was getting the last word on social media, or who was liking that page. Or maybe we focus on our hurt feelings. We focus on past transgressions, on decisions that don't go our way. We focus on our retirement funds. We focus on institutions that are changing too much or not changing enough. And we realize we don't have any control over this. Our focus sometimes gets away from the very message of Jesus, and we lose sight of what he tells us about the importance of compassion and love. And we tend to forget that our mission as followers of Jesus is to minister to the very children of God that Christ himself says that he has come to minister to. Jesus' first healing act is focused on compassion and love. The rest of the gospel is simply centered on this very understanding of the ministry. Listen to how the Message reinterprets this passage. Directly on leaving the meeting place, they came to Simon and Andrew's house, accompanied by James and John. Simon's mother-in-law was sick in bed, burning up with fever. They told Jesus. He went to her, took her hand, and raised her up. No sooner had the fever left than she was fixing dinner for them. I like the way the Message kind of interprets that. There's a story about a little girl that was sent on an errand for her mom. And the little girl, it took her a long time to get back. And so, as you might imagine, that the mom was a bit upset and worried about the daughter when she came back. And she sat her down and she said, "What took you so long to come back?" And the little girl said that she came across a friend whose doll broke. And the mom looked at the little girl and she said, "Oh, you were helping her fix her doll." And the little girl said, "No, I was helping her cry." You know, that story touches us. I think we tend to resonate with it because it's like our gospel story in that we want to keep reading. We want to get to the end of the story because we know that this is the very mission, the goal, the focus of Jesus' ministry. And it kind of tugs at our heart and reminds us of what is truly important. This intense focus on treating the children of God as God's children. And this is the hint in understanding the Easter message this morning. As I told you before, each lesson in this sermon series builds upon the other. And that's why each of the lessons that Mark gives us kind of gives us these hints, these suggestions that's going to get us all the way to Easter on April 1st. And in each lesson, Mark plays around with these clues and gets us motivated to get to the end of the story. Now, sometimes these clues deal with what we talked about last week, the messianic secret. That moment where Jesus tells the people to not tell anybody about the secret. And sometimes the clue centers directly on recognizing Jesus. That actually happens today. Remember this passage? "And he cured many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him." Here the demons are silenced. And in every case of the messianic secret, Mark reminds us that the full picture of Jesus' ministry is not yet fully understood. Again, this will take place on Easter. But to gain a glimpse of this ministry, of what this ministry is all about, we need to see what Jesus sees. We need to look at humanity the way Jesus looks at us. We need to focus with the same intensity that Jesus focuses on all of God's children. This is our focus now. So, let's recap. I'm going to test you on what you remember about last week. I want everyone to turn to your right and say to them, "Do you want to know a secret?" So turn to your right and say, "Do you want to know a secret?" Okay? Now I want you to turn to your left and say, "Life is full of pain." Okay. Now I want you to turn behind you and say, "And who understands that pain?" Now I want you to tap on the shoulder of the person in front of you and just simply say, "Jesus." Okay, now I want you to turn to everyone on your right and say, "I'll repeat anything the pastor tells us to say." Okay, got a few here that are saying that. Okay. Last week, the first hint in this long lesson on the messianic secret is that pain is part of life. And Jesus understands your pain. We all know pain. We all know suffering. We all know indescribable grief. And that's why we must stay focused on this week's hint. We are all God's children. Everyone. Pastor Ed Marquardt is a pastor in Seattle. He tells this story about hearing from former NFL football coach Sam Rutigliano speak one time at a banquet. Now, Pastor Marquardt was thinking as he was going to this banquet that he was going to hear one of those Jocks for Jesus stories about how God was there, Jesus was there to make sure that Sam won all these games in the NFL. And in fact, as he was driving to this banquet, Pastor Marquardt was even humming his favorite football hymn, Drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalposts of life. End over end, neither left or right. Straight through the heart of those glorious uprights. Drop kick me, Jesus, through the goalposts of life. Pastor Marquardt, that's where he was. That was his cynical attitude that he had. Now, when Sam Rutigliano came out, his story was very different. He told how he was driving down the road with his 2-year-old daughter in the back seat and his wife in the side, and a car came upon them. There was an accident. The car rolled over, and their daughter got pinned underneath the car. Now, Pastor Marquardt, in this very cynical attitude, was expecting Sam Rutigliano to say that God gave him enough strength to pick up that car just by inches, and his wife was able to pull the daughter out. Or maybe he was thinking Rutigliano was going to say that it was a miracle that a tow truck came up at that immediate time and the daughter was saved. Or maybe Rutigliano was going to say that it was amazing a tow truck was there and an ambulance was there. They took our daughter to the hospital. She was in the hospital for a couple months. We prayed for her, but there was a miracle. But instead, Rutigliano looked at this very hushed crowd and just simply said, she was dead. Well, as the story goes, Rutigliano then went on to say how he and his wife had grieved so deeply and so long after the death of the little girl. It was an awful time for them. It was a terrible time for their marriage. But time went on, and Rutigliano's wife got pregnant again and answered a prayer. And the baby was born, but it was stillborn. It was too much for him to take, too much to handle, too much to grieve. As time went on, Sam says that he began to bargain with God. He used to say, God, if you bless us with another pregnancy, we will give our lives to you and dedicate this child to you. If you give us a healthy child, we'll be yours. And whatever you will do, we'll do this for you. If you, God, if you, God, if you, God. But in the midst of this, Sam began to hear an inner voice from God say, no deal, Sam. No manipulations. I rule over your life in all times and in all places. So here they were at this banquet, and Ed Marquardt said that Sam Rutigliano then looked at everyone and said, God has called me to be a servant in my turf, the National Football League. He rules over all aspects of my life, when winning or losing, in triumphs and tragedies. How about you? Where is your turf? Does God rule you there in your turf, in your situation? Not just when you're winning, but when you're losing. Not just during the triumphs, but during the tragedies of your life. Does God rule you then? You know, I was so intrigued by the story about Sam Rutigliano. I did my own research about this guy. I found out that he actually got in trouble with the NFL because he began to buck some of the rules that the NFL had about drug testing. They created a group that was called the Inner Circle, whose goal was specifically on people. And it was not focused on the very rules that the NFL had on drug testing. The goal was to get these players off of drugs and to treat them like human beings, to treat them like God's children. He did all this because he didn't lose focus on Jesus' ministry. His idea was that God was in control, and for Rutigliano, that was all that mattered. Brad Walden tells a true story about a 9-year-old boy named Mark. Mark's mother received a phone call one day in the middle of the afternoon. It was Mark's teacher. And the teacher said, Mrs. Smith, something unusual happened today in your son's 3rd grade class. Your son did something that surprised me so much that I thought you should know about it immediately. Now, I can tell you as a parent who has had children in school, no parent ever wants to get that call from their teacher. Can I get an amen there to parents? That is a scary call. But anyway, the teacher continued. Nothing like this has happened in all my years of teaching. This morning I was teaching a lesson on creative writing, and as always I do, I tell the story of the ant and the grasshopper. The ant works hard all summer and stores up plenty of food, but the grasshopper plays all summer and does no work. Then winter comes, the grasshopper begins to starve because he has no food. So he begins to beg, please, Mr. Ant, you have much food, please let me eat too. And then I say to the boys and girls, okay, boys and girls, your job is to finish writing the story. And then the teacher said to Mark's mom, your son raised his hand, and I called on him, and he says, ma'am, may I draw a picture? And so I said to your son, yes, you may draw a picture, but you still have to write the ending of the story. And then she said, as in all the years, most of the students said the ant shared his food through the winter, and both the ant and the grasshopper lived. Now, there were some students that would usually write, Mr. Grasshopper, you didn't work for this food, so I'm not going to give you any. And with that, the ant lived and the grasshopper died. But your son, said the teacher, your son did something different that no one has ever done before in my entire years of teaching. Your son said and wrote, so the ant gave all of his food to the grasshopper. The grasshopper lived, and the ant died. And the picture at the bottom of the page was of 3 crosses. Jesus' first act is to treat humanity as God's children. On Easter, April 1st, the end of the story becomes quite apparent as Jesus' final act has something to do with us as well. Stay tuned. I'm going to ask the ushers to wait upon us as we get back to God. Precious Lord, take my hand. Let us sing hymn number 474.
this.